go ahead and get started. My name is Bevin Baker. I'm with Fort Pitt Capital Group. I'll be your host today, and I'm joined by Tim from Harbinger Orchids. And just to tell you a little bit about the webinar and how that's going to work, we've got a few housekeeping items. So here is some information about me. So as Tim mentioned earlier, in addition to being a financial advisor at Fort Pitt Capital Group, I'm also a member of the Orchid Society of Western Pennsylvania, hence our speaker and our topic today. So at Fort Pitt Capital Group, I work with individuals, business owners, and the participants in our retirement plans to help make sure that they are maximizing their investments and their retirement benefits and to help them plan for the next stages of their life. When I am not at Fort Pitt Capital Group, you can usually find me performing, acting, or singing on a local stage, enjoying the outdoors, or at an Orchid Society meeting. So a little bit of information about Fort Pitt Capital Group. So we are an investment advisory firm that was formed in Pittsburgh 27 years ago. Our headquarters is in Greentree. We also have offices in Harrisburg and Florida. We have clients all over the country. So we really want clients to have a boutique feel with a dedicated advisory firm, but also have the resources that come with larger firms. So we're really kind of the perfect size there that's right in the middle. So why we do our webinars. So we really want to be a resource to our clients, to our friends, to our family, to our neighbors, and really be life advisors for you and help you to coordinate different aspects of your life. So that includes talking about things that are very timely, like diversification, especially in today's market conditions, but also bringing other interesting topics and resources, hence Tim joining us here today. So different ways to interact with us. So on your device, you can tap the screen to ask questions, or there are some handouts that are available at the end as well. On a computer, there's a space to access those handouts and also type questions into the chat. And here's where the questions and the handouts will appear. So what is diversification? Why is that important? So diversification and diversity is an important topic in life, in work, talking about your investments, as well as in the beautiful world of orchids, when Tim addresses that later. So it's really the practice of not putting all of your eggs in one basket. Very popular phrase. And the reason that we do that is we want to help to limit exposure in any one particular asset or one particular asset class. You can imagine if in 2008 you only had stocks that were in the housing market, how damaging that can be. So we want to make sure that we spread that risk out. Why is it important? So reasons that we really want to make sure to focus on diversification is how that is going to affect the overall performance of your investments and making sure that we have a good risk-return relationship there and what that looks like. So a lot of folks like to call it the only free lunch that is in investing. So there is inherent risk that comes with investing, right? But if we're able to reduce the overall volatility of your portfolio, but increase the potential for overall returns, and there really is a sweet spot for doing that, and that's what we help to design for clients. So we know that if you truly have a diversified portfolio, some things are going to be up and some things are going to be down. So if your portfolio is like a garden, right? You've got your summer crops and your winter crops, and we want to be, continuously harvesting what's ripe and making sure that, our seeds are going to be there for the next season as well. So whenever we're diversifying your portfolio, that's what we're doing. And we're also being selective as to what it is that we're harvesting. So we're not harvesting absolutely everything, not time to harvest the seeds yet. So a long-term perspective is also very important to keep whenever it is that you're investing, because we know that there's going to be short-term volatility at times. We're experiencing that in the market right now. So making sure that we've got kind of enough reparations, right? That's part of the diversification is, do you have enough cash and enough safer investments to kind of winter over, right? But not too much, because then you run the risk of inflation as well, which is going to continue to erode your buying power. So this is one of my favorite slides. This shows different types of asset classes, and it's very varied, right? Almost as varied as the world of orchids, right, Tim? Yep. So these are the top performing asset classes going back to 2007. And you're gonna see that these colors dance around a lot. So the reason that we wanna have a diversified portfolio is because we simply don't know what the top performers are gonna be that year. So this is what the equity markets or the stocks look like over that period of time. And this is your fixed income, or typically your bonds. And you're going to see that white box throughout the middle. That's your asset allocation. So what that means is that is a varied portfolio in this example of stocks and bonds. And we can see that that performs about the middle, right? There are some ups and downs, but not nearly the swings that you're going to see in other asset classes. And so that's why we really want to make sure that you have a strategically diversified portfolio to help to ride out some of that volatility, because volatility is something that can really turn off and scare a lot of investors, right? And that's understandable. You know, we work hard for our money, and we're often managing people's life savings. So we want to make sure that we're doing that in a very prudent investment manner. So we've talked about how, you know, some of the reasons that diversifying your portfolio is important. So you may be thinking, how do you do that? So buying different asset classes. So an asset class is simply a grouping of investments, right? So those can be large cap stocks. Those can be larger companies. Those can be mid cap and small cap. That's just the size of the companies they are. That can be bonds as well. That could be government bonds. That could be corporate bonds. Municipal bonds as examples, and also cash. That's an asset that's important to have, and making sure that someone has enough cash reserves so that they don't, you know, quote unquote, have to go out in the storm, right? So if there's market volatility, the market's down, you know, do you have enough that those aren't the assets that you have to sell? Because that's something that, you know, we really want to avoid. We want to be able to be strategic about when we do that. So the other thing is you also want to diversify within your stocks and bonds, right? So we talked about different kinds of stocks and bonds. That's something I just mentioned. But it's also what sectors are they in, right? What industries? Do you have technology and healthcare and commodities and consumer staples? Because in my example about 2008 and the housing market, right, you want to make sure that you have what we call non-correlated asset classes. So again, in a collection that you might have, like a collection of orchids, for instance, you want to make sure that you have what's going to fit you and your style, but it's also nice to have, you know, some different variety to choose from, but it's something that's really essential in this example. Also, what sector they're in. You know, are you focusing on things that are just domestic? Do you have some international that's there? So all important parts of the strategy. So sometimes people think that they are diversified, but might not be. And so here are some examples of what that would look like, right? Only stocks. Not super diversified, right? Now you can have many different kinds of stocks, and that might be appropriate for certain investors, especially if they have a long timeline and a long horizon. If they are, you know, we have an example here of maybe someone's not as diversified, but again, we can see a much more variegated template there of many different asset classes within that. So important factors. with a longer time horizon, right? So if somebody is, say, 20 years from retirement, they might be comfortable taking on more risk because they're going to be able to ride out that volatility. Something that's very important is that regardless of what your time horizon looks like, you want to make sure that the level of risk that you have taken on is something that you are comfortable with. And also to revisit that on an ongoing basis, because that's going to change with time. Here are some examples of how much risk you might be comfortable with and what different portfolios look like, from conservative to aggressive growth. And we can see that obviously the more growth that you're taking on, typically the higher returns you get averaged over time. But really matching that with your timeline and the amount of risk you're comfortable with is really key. You also have to revisit it. So here are examples of if somebody did not rebalance versus the effect of rebalancing. So different assets in your portfolio are going to shrink and grow at different rates over time. So it is something that you need to revisit if that's something that you're doing on your own, or if you're working with an advisor. It's really important to at least once a year to go back and see, have any of those proportions changed and what that looks like to get things back into spec. So how can diversification go wrong? Well, like all good things, in moderation and in balance. So you can have too little, or you can have too much. Too much is also not good. One, it can be a lot to keep track of, especially if you're doing it on your own. It can also become very costly to maintain. So there really is a sweet spot where we want to balance the amount of risk versus the amount of return that you're expected to get, and make sure that that's in line, right? We never want to reduce a portfolio's returns without meaningfully reducing its risk. That's an important relationship to keep there. And it's something that's really different for everyone. There's no one size fits all answer. So if you have an advisor or you're looking for one, that's an important conversation to have, or making sure that you have a good solid plan. So steps to success. Create a written investment plan and make sure that it is tailored to your needs. That's something that's really important, something that is written down and that you can refer back to. When I work with my clients, that's really our first step, is what that looks like, and it really provides us a blueprint. Determine the right amount of risk for your goals and for your timeline, and then continue to cultivate, to manage and revisit that plan as well. So a few things to remember. Diversification can help to mitigate risk, something we're all looking for, right? Something that's very timely and topical, especially with the current market conditions. You may want to avoid costly mistakes, right? Make sure that you are comfortable with the amount of risk that you're taking on. Revisit and rebalance. Once a year is typically a good amount. You can also rebalance too frequently. That can also, be something to worry about, because you want to give your investments time to perform as they're supposed to, or to come back if there's a downturn. Take a look at it once a year, reevaluate as you need to. And if you do not have the desire, the knowledge, or the time to do this yourself, it's okay to outsource. We are still taking new clients. I know that I am in my book of business. There are a lot of, really great professionals out there that can help you with this. And that's something that, we help clients with every day. Here are a few different ways that we help our clients. So we really want to make sure that our client is whole from a holistic standpoint. So not just their investments, it can be their retirement. Do they have proper insurance that's set up? Do they have a will? Have they revisited? Things of that nature. So both in-house here at Fort Pitt Capital Group, we help our clients with some of these aspects here on this wheel, and then we coordinate with other professionals too. So that you really have a group of trusted advisors. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tim. And just remember, there will be question and answer at the end. So those of you who have been putting questions in the chat, thank you so much. And you've still got an opportunity to do so. And Tim,
thank you.
On to you.
This is just a small smattering of the diversity in the orchid family. I've been a member of the Orchid Society of Western Pennsylvania for 39 years, almost going on 40. I'm involved in so many other different plant groups as well that I'm pretty diverse. You know, the corpse flowers, daylilies, hostas, a lot of native things, and a bunch of other things as well. The thing about the presentation, there's a handout that comes with it. Please download that and print that out, because a lot of it's basically an outline of the text within the presentation. I'm going to skip through some of the less interesting text. It's interesting, but for time constraints, I'm going to skip through it. But I include it in the handout. So due to time constraints, I think I'm just going to start. Orchid family contains about 25 to 28,000 species. There's a fight going on between orchid people and aster people as to which family actually has the most species, and I understand that Orchidaceae has the second highest at this point. We go back and forth constantly. You know, we have more, you have more, we have more, you have more. They're found on every continent except Antarctica. You find orchids that are terrestrial. Those are those that grow in the soil or in the ground. And then the vast majority of orchids that you will grow, that you will find in the big box stores, or you will find at orchid shows, et cetera, are epiphytic, which means they grow attached to trees, or some of them grow in the smaller branches of some shrubs, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to skip through most of this first slide because that's on the handout. Just a little more interesting facts. I'm going to start off with a really weird orchid that I'm sure nobody has heard of, Rhizanthella. It's an interesting, it comes from Australia where everything is weird and everything is wonderful and fantastic, or trying to kill you. The inflorescence, the flower part, never pushes through the surface. The entire plant does not really push through the surface of the soil. It's completely subterranean. Flower is about 1 inch across, or for those who adhere to metric, is about 2 to 3 centimeters. And this is what it looks like. They have scraped away the surface, the leaf litter, et cetera, and this is actually what they look like. It sort of looks like one of the worm things from Dune. But it's a tiny little thing, but this is what it looks like in cross-section underground. That is all that exists as. The things that look like bird heads on the right slide are individual flowers, so it's not just a single flower, it's a capitulum, a large group of flowers, and very rarely will find it unless you know where it is and you're there at the right time. So just a very weird. I'm not going to pause here for questions, even though the presentation does. We'll save questions to the end. Biggest group of orchids you're going to know about, or you're going to probably have in your house to grow, are the tropical orchids. These are evergreen, deciduous, or with distinct dormancy, but for the most part, they're not going to survive a cold winter. I'm just going to leave this for the handout for you guys to read. And Angrecum is it's 220 species, and we're just going to talk about some of them. If you've heard of Angrecum sesquipetale, is what they call Darwin's orchid. I'm not going to get into a lot of that, but basically he saw this orchid and he saw the long spur on the flower and said, and it's fragrant at night, and he hypothesized that it is pollinated by a moth with a tongue that length. And I think it was 58 years later, they discovered the moth. And it's only, I think it was within the last 10 or 15 years that they actually have a video of the moth pollinating the flower. So it's really, it's been almost 200 years of work to actually find this. And just some of the diversity just within this genus, this group of orchids. These are some small or miniature plants. Most of these, again, you see the long spur and the compactum, are fragrant at night. And some of it looks a little more spidery. Eclarianum, that's one of the more colorful ones. Most of them are pure white. Floralentum, this one will flower 2-3 times a year. Very strong fragrance of vanilla. The flower tip to tip is about 5.5 to 6 inches.
It's a big flower.
Yeah. Well, I failed to mention, the sesquipedalae is about 7 inches across. So they are, I mean, there's some very large flowers in the groups. Versavilla, Central and South American, 18 to 21 species. And this is another group that has primarily white flowers, which of course are fragrant at night, so moth pollinated again. And just to show you, Cucullata has a really neat long projection on the lip. The nodosa on the right side is actually permanently displayed in the Phipps Conservatory room now as you walk in the door to the orchid exhibit. Moving forward, Catasetum, there's a group of orchids here, but I'm going to primarily talk about Catasetum. One very cool fact that I'm going to talk about, you could read this from the handout, but I'm going to move forward. They go back and forth between being male and female. One year it can be male, next year it can be female, and the flowers of the male and the females are very different. The other thing that I probably don't have in the handout is the male flowers actually fire pollen at their pollinators. So I don't get into that with this, but it's an interesting side note. But this is Cicatum, which is just an interesting species. That flower is about 4 inches across, so there's a lot of flower surface there. Now, Sanguinium, this is the same plant in different years. And this is actually a Phipps Conservatory plant. And you can see that it is a very different flower and getting even more different. Tabulary, the male flower is the more colorful, and then the green one in the right is the female. And this is a hybrid. They've done a lot of hybridizing with these and made some big honkin' beautiful hybrids with this. And again, just to show you difference between the male and the females. Now, moving on to Cattleyas. Anybody who has a grandmother, yeah, that made sense. This is basically your grandmother's corsage orchids back in the 40s, 50s, and even before that. If your grandmother or mother, in my case, wore an orchid, it was likely going to be this. And this was bridal orchids, et cetera, et cetera. We have the species, then we have actually hybridized these to the point where they're into the 22nd to 25th generation. So there's a lot of play going on there. And just some of them, the Ludomaniana, Persiviliana, Mossiae, these are primarily what you would think of as the corsage orchids, and the rest of these are just real relatives. So we're gonna look at a few more. And then we're going to talk, well, just a few more here. Puparata in itself has enough diversity that it is the national flower of Brazil. They actually do shows that only have that species, and you go to these shows and they'll have 1,500 plants of just that in the various color forms. And then we're going to talk about, just look at some hybrids, just the amazing diversity that people with toothpicks have managed to produce. Dendrobium, it's a very large genus, so it's not very many slides here, so I'm not going to really talk about a lot of them, just give you a cross-section of what's going on with the genus. First of all, when we look at the foliage, I used to be able to pronounce this, Lichenastrum is a tiny, those tiny leaves are not even the size of my little fingernail. Pochellum is about 8 feet tall. So very different. Cucumerum looks like cucumbers. And the Penguinum has about 25 or 30 flowers on it. That's a 1-inch pot. So a lot of diversity just amongst size of the plant. And believe it or not, yeah, that's Lichenastrum. The flowers on it, how small they are compared to my hand. Anceps has interesting foliage. That's a Phipps Conservatory plant. And then just some of the flowers that we see. These are just some of the species. Spectably actually supposed to look like that. It's not a mutated flower. And then some of the hybrids. And these are readily, a lot of these are just readily available through various orchid vendors, et cetera, et cetera. Moving forward into Epidendrum. This is another enormous genus, so I'm just going to touch upon it a bit. First group we call the reed-stemmed epidendrums, and this particular plant was about 6 feet across and probably 3.5 to 4 feet tall. And just to show close-ups of the flowers. More related to that, this is actually the same species, but just different color forms. Secundum, beautiful orange. These have actually become invasive in southern Florida. And miniatures. Quisianum is about a 2-inch pot, so tiny little thing. Escobaranum about the same. Porpax is a scrambling growth pattern, but really cool, almost looks like a Japanese beetle flower. And then this is another, Leucocylum is another Phipps Conservatory plant. Very, again, white flower, fragrant at night, moth pollinated. Flower plant there is about 3.5 feet tall, but the flowers are probably 4 inches, 5 inches. Another epidendrum. This is what this was exhibited during one of the orchid shows. Phalaenopsis. This is what you tend to think of as your typical orchid. This is everybody's introduction orchid. I refer to them as the big box store orchids. Little side note, these primarily come from Southeast Asia, tropical areas of Southeast Asia. Most of the species that go into the hybrids that you're finding in the big box stores are tropical species. So when you see the little tag that says ice cubes only, I kind of have a stroke and a heart attack. It's not proper to water. You need to just water your orchid rather than subject it to, ice is for a martini, not or a margarita, not for your orchid. So these again are into the 18th to 25th generation, so they're very much removed from the species. So these are just some of the species. When you look at a white hybrid, you're primarily Amabilis and Aphrodite. When you get into some spots, you're getting Lutemaniana. Yellows, you're getting some Ambonensis. So there's a mixture in all of these species in your hybrids. Philippenensis, again, white, Sturdiana, spots. Schilleriana, if you get pinks, and Pulcherrima, pinks as well. Venosa goes into yellows as well. And then these are some of your hybrids. First, Phalaenopsis, 30 years ago, all you saw were whites with a red lip, pinks, and then the striped ones came in later. Now we've got the gamut of weird spots, striations, yellow. The spots are amazing on some of these because if you look at the Brother Piocher, which is not a typo, that is the same plant. And those two flowers you see the inset are actually on the same inflorescence. So they're very different even on the same flowering. And then we have novelty hybrids now that are more star-shaped, but it also reintroduces fragrance that have been lost in some of the big honkin', big typical standard Phalaenopsis. Again, I'm going to skip through the pause and we're going to wait. Slipper orchids. Slipper orchids, when we talk about Phipps Conservatory, which I tend to talk about a lot, do a lot of work and talk through Phipps Conservatory. Phipps Conservatory is the National Lady Slipper Orchid Collection. There are 5 genera that the Lady Slipper Orchid Collection is concentrating on. And you can, in the handout, you can read the various species and where they're from. The one thing I will mention is that we do actually have native North American Lady Slipper orchids. Those will be the last few slides in the presentation that we'll talk about those. But not just species it's concentrating on preserving, it's hybrids. And skip forward here. Path Hericianum was the first Pathiopetalum hybrid made. It was made in 1869. The cultivar called GS Ball was from the original cross, so it's from 1869. That plant is still in cultivation. It's actually fairly common in cultivation, even though it is that old. It is actually, those two photographs are from Phipps Conservatory, and if you go around the time of the orchid show, that plant is almost always going to be there. So we're just going to skip through some of the species. The top row are primarily from Vietnam and southern China. Bottom row are Thailand, Southeast Asia kind of area. Just some more, just difference even within just one genus is pretty amazing. Sugianum was just described in 2012, so new species even being described up to this day. And again, big multifloral. Sanderianum has the world's record for the largest flower from tip to tip. It's over 3 feet. And then we have sequential bloomers. That some of those spikes can continue to flower for a year, 2 years. And some hybrids. Phragmipediums, these are South American, Central and South American. Andrediae was described in 2009, so relatively new species again. Richteri was actually described from a plant that was grown by a Pittsburgh local. And some of the hybrids, some of these are big flowers. The afterglow is probably 7 inches across. Leslie Gary has petals that are up to 24 inches long. They call those the Fu Manchu orchid. And just some more. Paul Eugene Conroy is a hybrid I registered. Again, those petals are almost 3 feet. Now I am going to spend a little time, just maybe a minute or minute and a half here. Mexipedium xerophyticum is sort of the conservationist's dream / nightmare. It's discovered in the late 1980s, published in 1990. When it was discovered, they collected 3 plants from its native habitat, brought them into cultivation. Shortly after that, there was a series of fires. It was declared extinct after 2 decades of searching for the plant. So all the plants in cultivation stem from 2 of those 3 original plants. In 2010, they found a tiny population of this in a neighboring province in Oaxaca, Mexico. And that only contains 10 to 20 plants. It's on private property. It is being preserved. So it is it's a rare plant. It's probably one of the rarest plants in the world in nature, as there's only 10 to 20 plants known. But in cultivation, it still succeeds and it survives. Again, we're going to skip through the pause. Temperate or hardy orchids. Now, this is probably where most people who have gardens go crazy. There are orchids, and the 2 hikes that, well, 3 hikes that the Society have gone up to, one near Hazleton, which is near Scranton, Hazleton, PA, near Scranton. We also do a single hike that takes us to State College and outside of Altoona. And then we did another hike to West Virginia. And the picture on the left is West Virginia. The picture on the right is near Scranton, the Hazleton area. And that's when I was a lot thinner and younger. Again, this you can read about Goodyear, but just one of the crazy orchids. This is what we call a jewel orchid. It's primarily grown for its foliage, but it does have little flowers that are kind of neat, bee pollinated. Platanthera is another fairly large genus. It's an interesting group. North America and Europe and Asia, actually touches southern Greenland and actually goes the whole way up into Hudson Bay. A lot of these are called the butterfly or fringed orchids, and they tend to be the most often seen because they're very visible flowers. This particular group of plants, Blephariglottis and Ciliaris, this is from the Hazelton group, one of the 3 places in the country in which they actually hybridize. So bicolor is actually, where Mother Nature has done nutty stuff. Psychodes is called the large purple orchis, and Schreiberi, just beautiful flowers. Tall spikes up to 4 feet tall, individual flowers about 1 inch. Not really very showy one, but a very, very beautiful, to me at least, orbiculata. Cypripedium. Now, this is where we're talking about the native lady slipper orchids, and I will go a little bit more into this because it's probably of more interest to those who have gardens. There's about 50 to 60 species. Primarily, majority of them are Eastern Asian, Himalaya, Eastern Siberia, China, and Taiwan. But we have some species in North America. We have 5 or 6 in Pennsylvania alone. A lot of the Asian species, the Chinese especially species, are very easily grown and cultivated in our gardens. Problem is that wild collected plants tend to only survive a few years and then eventually will peter out and die unless you really know what you're doing. We'll talk about Acai in a second, but it's the most widespread lady slipper in the United States. It's probably second only to the Eurasian Calceolaris. It has very specific growing conditions, and if you take it out of the wild and put it in your garden, the mortality rate is about 90 to 95% within 2 years. It's very rare for these plants to be relocated and to survive. And a lot of people, when they think of orchids, native orchids, they think of this pink lady slipper. Had the opportunity when I was at Penn State, this is outside of Penn State, to follow this colony for 5 years and did some research. I followed pollinators, which actually is a little more exciting than it sounds. I literally followed pollinators through the woods. At least it's interesting to me, but it kept me skinny at the time too. So that's Acai. This is also called the moccasin flower, and this is the one that is very hard to transplant out. Pubescens. This is it's fairly easy to grow, and these are in cultivation, and we do have vendors who actually do sell these. The plant on the left is actually my garden plant, and the other 2 are from the Altoona hikes. And then Regina, it's the showy lady slipper. This is the provincial and state flower of Manitoba and Minnesota. It began with an M. But again, another of our beautiful native lady slipper orchids. And again, this is in my garden, and you can see the weeds grow. Blooming in the back. It's amazing when you have weeds that bloom in your garden. So.
Yeah, okay. Well, it sounds like everything blooms in your garden.
Yeah. Well, it kind of does. But I just realized they do have some hybrids. We've actually been crazy enough to play with things. So there are some hybrids. This doesn't look particularly beautiful color-wise, but it is a large flower. It's actually a hybrid between a Chinese species and one of our Native American species. And then we have these guys, which these are hybrids of, again, Chinese species and one of our American species. And then the end.
Okay. Thanks so much, Tim. Okay. So now is time for questions. And I know that we have had some in the chat, which we always appreciate. So let's take a look at some of those. All right. Tim, first question's for you. What are the most forgiving orchids to grow at home?
Most forgiving are, let's face it, Phalaenopsis. As much as they're everywhere. They are forgiving. There are a few tips that you need to grow them. Like you water them, you do not use ice cubes. They do need repotted yearly or every other year. I tend to push it to 2 years. Primarily, their biggest thing is the watering issue. If the leaves are down and limp, they're not getting enough water, and that could be a symptom of two things, either too much water or too little. Another group would be the cattleyas, the old-fashioned corsage orchids. They have so many different hybrids now. They have literally plants that are 3 feet tall, little big for a regular collection. They also have plants that are, they're only 3 or 4 inches tall. I would say that those two would be your best bet for easy to grow orchids.
Yeah, there's a Phalaenopsis in my office here.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to check that out. I didn't see that.
And picked up a couple of lady slippers at the orchid show.
Oh,
yeah,
that's even better.
They're still doing okay. We also had a question about varieties that grow in gardens in PA. So what are some of the ones that you have?
Your best bet, so far as orchids, would be the lady slippers, because they've done a lot of hybridizing with these. Well, not a lot, but they've started doing some hybridizing, so you can actually have some really cool hybrids that are a little more resilient than just straight species. There are a handful of people, only a handful of people in the country that actually do sell them enough to put them on a website. There are a few of the Platantheras, the purple fringed orchids, but those are probably your 2 best bets so far as getting orchids. There are some European native orchids that have started showing up in gardens here. There's actually an invasive orchid from Europe. Oh. Nobody ever thinks of orchids being invasive, no. But there actually is one, and it actually grows as a weed throughout Shadyside in Pittsburgh.
You're gonna have to tell me what streets in Shadyside. I have to take myself on a walk.
Everywhere, literally any place that is mulched has that orchid.
Okay, all right, so. Noted. Still not good to have invasive species. That sounds much more beautiful than Japanese knotweed.
Yes.
And a question for me, how do I help my clients through hard times like the current market? Very good question, very timely. So it does all go back to having that written plan. So whenever I initially meet with my clients, talking to them about their income needs is something that is extremely important. So we like to build maybe a year or two. If someone is taking income from their account, or that they are going to be in the next few years, we want to make sure that they have got about a year or 2 in cash and maybe 3 to 5 years in bonds. And then we've got the rest invested in the market, because that is really our best hedge against inflation. Because we know if we're too conservative, then someone's buying power is going to be eroded over time, which inflation is another risk. But we know if we're too aggressive as well, we might have to go out in the store, right? You don't want 100% of your portfolio to be in stocks right now if that is where you are taking your income from, right? So we always build in a bit of a cash cushion there, and then kind of build, around that for what your needs are. So that's something that we go back to, is what the plan is, see if anything has changed in their lives or with their needs. And also, talking to them about what this has looked like historically. There is a very popular chart that's intra-year declines as to the lowest point that the market was versus where the market ended. And you can see, what that looks like, and going back to, other downtimes and recessions. I've worked in finance for over 18 years. So I've weathered some tough times, and I know that it's hard, but we do know that the market is going to come back at some point. And we use that as a discussion too about, are they comfortable with the amount of risk that they're taking? Is that something we just need to talk to, or something we need to revisit? Now might not be the best time to pull back, but something that we can certainly build in if somebody is truly not comfortable with that. and looking at what, their returns have been over time as well, and how much, if they've been invested for a while, how much their account has grown, because we've had some really great years in the market the last few years. Right now, just, not so much fun. That's okay. I mean, one of the things I do is I call my clients, especially during current, market conditions, and saying, how are you doing? Has anything changed? Do we need to do a review? And really keeping those lines of communications open. And we've got some resources. There's an email we just sent out to our clients, kind of, talking them through this and what's going on right now. And we have a webinar that is coming up as well. So we have a webinar specifically on weathering the recession. And so there's another slide that we've got where we're going to be talking about some of those upcoming dates as well. Great. All right, another question for me. How much money do you need to be considered for a client? So that is something that we, really talk to our clients about and make sure that, it's a good fit for them. And in terms of, taking on new clients. So truthfully, we don't have a hard and fast rule about you have to have this much money, right? Because that's going to be different for every person. And oftentimes we manage people's life savings. So have a conversation with us. You're not going to be turned away at the door. But, we work with people through different parts of their lives. I work with some folks with what I like to call the emerging wealth segment, right? So people that are starting out on their investment journey, or maybe there's a transition that they just had, a major life change, a marriage, a divorce, a death, something like that. And that's something that we really help people through. So have a conversation with us, have a conversation with me. Happy to talk to you about that and, see if it's a good fit or at least, give you some helpful advice as well. Something, that I really, really love about this firm is that we're encouraged to use our judgment and see what really makes sense and is, for the greater good, for the good of all concerned. So I mentioned as well about the how to prep for if there is going to be an upcoming recession, especially if someone's in retirement. That can be really scary, right? So there is going to be a webinar in 2 weeks, and also reach out to your advisor. That is truly what we are here for. Or if you've been managing, your investments on your own, you've done a great job, but maybe the current, downturn is a little bit too much for you. You're doing some nail biting or just you're ready to turn that over. That's something that is okay to do. And we're really here to help, talk you through this and also put numbers to it too. The average comeback from a market downturn, going back to the Great Depression, is 4.5 years. So that's why we are building these numbers and these factors around things that are, based in historical data, right? Data is always a good thing. All right. Oh, here's a fun one that's for both of us. How did we both get interested in orchids? You want to answer that one first, Tim?
This might take 45 minutes.
Oh, we need another webinar.
Yeah, I do. I do want to do it. I was always a plant geek, and I started when I was a youngling, just puttering around the yard and just. I don't know exactly what the decision was, but my mother took me to an orchid show when I was a youngling, and to her, great dismay after many years of it was some people went fishing, some people did sports. I went to orchid shows and was involved with the Orchid Society, and then again that branched out into all the other plants that I'm interested in as well. It's the amount of nitpicking to grow some of these different weird species of orchids, because they do not all of them, but quite a few of them grow differently. It actually makes you a more meticulous person actually in your life, and not just with plants, with everything. You learn to dissect and pick things apart. So I was always, preordained to be working with plants, and it just happened to be orchids where I ended up being published and did a lot of the work that I eventually did. And I will pass it to you.
Sure. So I really liked plants and trees and nature from when I was very young. And my two favorite flowers were always orchids and lilies. So Tim, the corsage flowers, not just for your grandma, there's a picture of me wearing one of those to prom and homecoming. They were always my flower. And they were something that also, were fairly readily available, right? You can go into a grocery store and see how many Phalaenopsis, right? The moth orchid was there. But I also grew up going to Phipps, and the orchid room was always my favorite, such a wonderful sanctuary. And then that's really continued, as an adult. I met a wonderful person from the Orchid Society, which is another organization that we support here at Fort Pitt Capital Group, and went to the show, which was really wonderful. I recognized some of those pictures, and it is incredible, the diversity within that family of plants. I mean, it really is. I can't think of one, at least, that is quite that varied. I mean, sometimes you wouldn't even know that they're both the same kind of plant. And they also, you do have to be pretty meticulous. Especially with some of the more difficult ones to grow, very deliberate about watering and the schedule and fertilizing and the amount of light and the amount of moisture. I had some wonderful education at the orchid show where about the water and how it can kind of get into the leaf structure and introduce the plant to disease, infection, things like that. So I've been known to take a Q-tip and dry out my plant. See, I listen.
Paper towel, whatever you can do.
Paper towel, whatever you can do.
Yep.
So it's something that you have to be pretty detail oriented. You have to be pretty meticulous. It really is a great partnership, us doing this webinar together, because a lot of it has to do with, what I do for a living and what we do here at Fort Pitt Capital Group. So, and you also meet really interesting people who are also into orchids. I went to the show by myself. I met lovely people. The vendor that I bought the lady slippers from has his cell phone number in the plant spike, and he says, if anything's going wrong, you call me. I mean, it's just really, really incredible. So it's nice to find, new and different ways, to connect to people, something that I really enjoy.
I refer to it as my delving into my mental illness. My obsessive nature, it just comes out in growing plants. And there are so many fun personalities in various groups, like the Orchid Society. I'll put that out there, the Orchid Society. We do a lot of volunteer work through Phipps. So if you join the society, you can actually, and this goes to you, I'm inviting you to come join the Phipps initiatives. We have two Phipps programs in which we do a lot of the repotting at Phipps. We also have another one where we do their inventory. We caretake the National Lady Slipper Orchid Collection. So if you're worried about repotting your orchid, join the society. We will get you paired up with two experts, at least two regulars, and you can come and practice on the Phipps plants.
Oh, that's great.
And I figure, if something happens, we'll be like, oh, stuff happens.
True.
You're practicing on other people's plants, and if it's too deep, too whatever, we'll correct you, but stuff happens.
Well, that's great. That's a wonderful resource. So what else do we have coming up? So we do have a very regular webinar series here that we do at Fort Pitt Capital Group. Here's that one on how to survive a recession, insights on a volatile market. Anyone that's concerned about market conditions, please tune into that. It's going to give you some insight and some resources because we get it, right? And we want to help, talk and walk you through that. Another topic near and dear to my heart, cash balance pension plans, a member of our retirement plan services group. That's something that's really important and insightful for business owners, and some additional resources and things that, people don't talk about quite as much as, things like 401ks. Also, elder care planning for your aging parents. As someone that has gone through that myself, it's really nice to have other people and experts to talk to. Very, very valuable. Tim, do you have any webinars coming up? Anything you want to plug?
No web. My next speaking is Sunday at the actual Orchid Society meeting.
Okay.
The meeting is held at the Phipps Garden Center, which is on the corner of 5th and Shady. And the meeting proper, doors open at 12:30. I'm doing a presentation on Habanero orchids, which it's a group of orchids from Southeast Asia. I've published a couple species there. And they're interesting in that they are dormant half the year. And I refer to these orchids, same with the corpse flowers. These are plants that you technically can only kill half the year, because while they're dormant, you pretty much leave them alone. And they have some of the most exotic fringe lipped flowers. I didn't put them in the presentation because of time constraints, but that's my next one.
Okay, wonderful. And then also, how can you get in touch with us? So here's my information here. You can call us, you can email us as well. It's going to be answered by a phone right here in Green Tree. Talk to a real person. I would love to talk to any of you one-on-one if you've got questions about diversification, different strategies, how that works for you, or you just need somebody to bounce ideas off of, as well, when making some of these important financial decisions. And Tim, how would folks get in touch with you?
If you print out the handout, at the very top of the handout is my website. But I will be more than happy to give out my phone number, preferably text, because, well, we're in that day and age where nobody wants to hear from anybody anymore. But my phone number is 814-574-2551. Text me questions. My website is harbingerorchids.com. My contact information is there. And the contact information is at the top of the handout. I am more than happy to take questions. If you have garden groups that you need somebody to talk at, I have various topics, and I just love to talk to people, obviously, right?
All right. Well, thank you again for taking time out of your day to join us. We really appreciate it. And Tim Choltco, did I say it right?
That's close.
Right.
I just tell everybody to say Smith.
My last name is Baker, so that one's easy.
Oh, that's really easy.
So thank you again so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Come back and see us for some of the other webinars in the series. Stay in touch. Also, if you've got ideas for other topics, financial or not, that you would really like to hear us talk about, please let us know. We really appreciate your feedback, and thank you again.
Well,